I really wanted to see like how does our inner contribute to outer change, and is there a connection? I always put it, or for me, it has this greater context that I want to do it for personal as well as planetary health. I often talk about eco-philosophy because any philosophy, like one thing that I want to, at least what I have for myself as the goal is to always see it in this ecological context, which has planetary boundaries, which has a real physical reality. One of the things that I thought about is like, okay, I want to find my philosophy. And this was one of the main drivers for a long time in my life without me even knowing. Like I wanted to find, okay, what's the philosophy I can live by? What are the principles, values that I really want to see in my everyday life? And then I saw these two parts of having a philosophy and living philosophically or living that philosophy. So turning those values, belief systems, actually turning them into action. And I thought like, okay, these two parts make like philosophy as a way of life, or make philosophy tangible. And then eventually I noticed, but this having a philosophy, I've been searching for the philosophy now for the last 10 years and I still haven't found it. And it's almost like at one point I'm like, should I give up hope that eventually I'm going to find it? But then I noticed, well, no, it's so much more about this process of finding it is actually living philosophically. And that's the beauty of it. And then it kind of noticed for the first time, well, philosophy is called love of wisdom. So, but it's a love of it and not having and possessing it. And the same for me became apparent with philosophy. Like it's not something I have, but it's really something on the one hand that I do, but also something that has sort of a life of its own, because as much as I have agency and as much as I can determine certain parts of that philosophy, at the same time, it's always influenced by so many people and it's always changing, adapting to my circumstances. So I will never be able to hold it. And as soon as I try to do that, I feel like it's already slipping away again.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. Today's guest is Jessica Böhme, a sustainability scientist, a transformation researcher. She is the founder and director of the Institute for Practical Eco-Philosophy, and she's a professor and academic director in technology management in Berlin. She also writes about philosophy and sustainability in her blog. She's following this tradition of philosophy as a way of life that you might have heard of from Pierre Hadot, which is also very connected to the Stoic ideas and to Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus. It's not the things that trouble us, but our judgment about things. That's one thread of this. Another thread would be the relational philosophy, the ideas of individuals as being entangled in their very essence, entangled together in our existence as our existence. Karen Barad writes about this a lot, about how to be entangled is to be intertwined with each other, but also part of one another. We aren't individuals in the sense of existing alone, but tangled up together. So Jess is looking at these kinds of ideas. Those are some inspirations that we talk about here in this conversation. She's trying to talk about them in a way that will be understandable and applicable no matter where you are or what's going on in your life. Taking some of these academic notions and translating them, however you want to say it, into other ways of expression. But it's also just that she's having an exploration herself and that she's sharing it with us through her writings and through her work, doing things called philosophy gyms, for example. So that's a European funded research program where different businesses, small to medium, actually take part in these philosophy gyms. And that's the idea that really drew me in, because I'm constantly trying to think of ways for us to understand ourselves as entangled with one another, but also to understand that physical and mental is in entanglement. The philosophy gym idea brings that together in a way. You're working out your mentality in a sense. I think of her work as trying to bring ecological love and philosophical thinking into everyday life, and from an engineering mindset and a business mindset. And that's a big, hard project. And so I just want to support her and introduce you to her, and I hope you'll find her work. I'm sure you'll enjoy reading her blog posts. We, in this conversation, talk about how she got to where she is and what she's really trying to do, what it means to her. We talk about this knowledge-action gap and value-action gap, where we know what's good for us, or we know what we should be doing, or we know what would lead to a better world, and yet we don't quite do it. We can't quite get motivated. Some of that is the disconnect that it's hard to figure out how to share and be successful, for example, without selling out or being inauthentic. And in her work, she wrestles with this a bit. She might have a title like, "This article will save your life," which is something a lot of people will click on. But then she notes that, you probably clicked on this because of that title. What is this about? And she explores that. We also talk about wildness. Her Substack is called wild philosophy. And I think this wildness speaks to the entanglement and the relationality, and how because we're so enmeshed and entangled with one another, we can never quite see the full picture. And that's a wildness. But also how philosophy as a way of life, or just critical thinking, the practice of philosophy, helps us to notice that movement in its patterns in different ways. And this is so helpful for structure, for scaffolding, for connection, for all the things that we need alongside that wildness. So wild philosophy and Jess's work, I think, is exploring a lot of this, and of course much more. And we talk about that here. There might be a little interruption from a dog. The office someone was ringing the doorbell, and so I'm sorry about that. If you're watching it as a video, you'll get to see the dogs at the end if you're a dog lover. I hope you're doing well out there in the world, wherever you may be. I just want to send you some support and some love, and I hope you find some words or videos or music or a tree, whatever you might need today that gives you a little energy, a little positivity, a little love in whatever way you might need it. Don't be afraid of it. Love matters. We're making it, and it's not easy, so let's try and help each other do it, okay? All right, here we go. Okay. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. I'm so glad you're here today. It's wonderful to meet you.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you as well.
So I kind of wish I was in Berlin and we could do this on a walk, I was thinking.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. Yeah.
We're both big walkers, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of my favorite activities, actually. Like walking and talking is just the best concept for me.
Me too. But for those who don't know you, you have quite a wide background. You seem to have some engineering. You certainly have philosophy. You have the ecological. How can we introduce you here in a way that's going to do justice to all those parts of you?
Yeah. My background is in mechanical engineering, and I've worked in that field also a little bit after I finished my studies. And after a short time, I felt a bit unease and started studying again sustainability and quality management, which was very business focused. But one thing that I did there was I looked at like what can I possibly contribute, and the first thing I looked at were technologies, because with my background it was kind of a given. And then I started going into like renewable energies and water technologies, and I saw like there's already so much out there, but why has it not been implemented on scale? Like what's underneath it? And that kind of got me into questioning, like, okay, if all these solutions are there, why is it not happening? And then at the same time, I started in my own life to really try to live according to a sustainable standard, which was, reducing my carbon footprint immensely, which was impossible, I would almost say, to do. But I really tried to see where in my own life am I not, acting ecologically, or also in my social, like in my relations, where am I not showing up in a way that I think the world needs us to show up. And that really like became this question of how do I live my life? And that became so much of a driver in regards to the challenges that I saw. They seem to be not on a technological level and not on a political level, but just people kind of pointing fingers at each other the whole time. Like the politicians would say, yeah, it's the companies would say it's the consumers, and then the consumers would say, well, we need to change politics. And then it would just go around and around, and nothing was really changing. So I was really looking at like, okay, what can I contribute to that, and how am I involved in the whole system? And that since then has been basically my main question of like, how do I live my life, which really got me into thinking a lot about complex systems, and eventually got me into philosophy, which I have no formal background in, actually. No, my PhD was very, very focused on very philosophical. But yeah, so I try to bring together these.
Can I ask what was your PhD about? Because it was very philosophical, but it wasn't philosophy. So
yeah, so it was in sustainability science, and what I was looking at was basically the way that I framed it was around inner transformation and sustainability, or inner and outer transformation, and how do these two relate. And I really wanted to see like, how does our inner contribute to outer change, and is there a connection? And eventually I noticed like, okay, one of these changes that we need to make is to switch from a really mechanistic way of understanding the world to a really relational way of understanding the world. But once we do that, then actually this idea of the inner can solve the outer kind of dissolves, but the inner and outer are really, basically two sides of the same coin. They're so closely related that it's hard to actually make that distinction, which which then got me into questioning, okay, what is this relational worldview, and which different disciplines have been already engaging with it. And I saw how many different fields are already, a part of that actually. So I looked at that, and then I tried to develop transformative educational processes in order to teach people like, how do they get from mechanistic to relational. And then afterwards, I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Like, this is such a mechanistic approach, getting from cause to effect.
That's wonderful that you bring it up like that, because, a lot of my project is trying to understand dichotomy and what does it mean to move beyond dichotomy or holding paradox, which I've found that it's not about solving that. You talk about solutions a lot too, and it's not about the solution. But I do think there's, at first, it sounds like you had it too. We feel like we have these two things that are contradictory and we need to resolve them, or we need to decide between them somehow. That if you're doing something that you've called inner transformation, then it must be different from whatever the outer transformation is. It starts to feel like a trap a bit in a lot of different, in science, in philosophy, in our everyday life, to try to make one into the other or choose between them. Does that speak? Did you feel that tension a bit when you were dealing
Yeah,
with that?
absolutely. And it took me quite some time to figure that out. Like when I started, first it started about like learning about what relational philosophy or what relational approaches even are, and a relational way of approaching the world. And the three spheres that I looked at right from the beginning were about our ways of knowing, being, and doing. Or Karen Barrett talks about it as an ethical onto epistemology. These three spheres are always interrelated. So I knew, okay, I don't just have to change what I know, but I also have to change like the way I approach it, the way I act it out, and that this is all involved into researching that as well. But I wasn't quite sure, like, how do I bring myself in that way, and especially in regards to doing research, like a relational lens to research is still something that's very much in the margins, especially in topics like sustainability science or transformation research, where I'm more or less situated. So developing, or it actually needs the developing of methods first in order to figure out how that works. And I've really wrapped my head around it so much, and I still am, and to some degree of like this question of how do we make the immeasurable measurable, even though, in a way I don't want to make it measurable. And, everything is related, but we also can't take it all into account. So finding this critical distinction between where does it become meaningless because we're taking too much into account, and how do we analyze, take apart, focus on one part of it that's maybe interesting, but at the same time don't lose the view for the whole.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where complex systems can help a bit too, and starting to think in what I imagine as multiplicities, which can be hard and it can be too overwhelming. But I wonder when you started getting into the relational thing, and because you're coming at it from a different way from me, and even though when I read your work, I really resonate a lot, and it's very interesting to me to try to understand how you came into it. So transformation, that's a big word, and
Yeah.
that research, and what kind of philosophy were you reading, or what did you first start to? I know you've referenced Whitehead, for example, and other process philosophy, but do you remember when you started having kind of
I think my entry point was actually rather through indigenous philosophies,
oh wow, great.
and that was the first time I came. Yeah, it really made sense to me. I would say, or I started. It still it sometimes doesn't make sense to me. At least it started to make sense to me to some point. And then it was very, very diverse, and it's hard to pin down. Um, Another one, or who has greatly influenced my thinking, was Karen Barrett. And trying to really understand what she means took me quite some time, and quite of different books as well were also, especially when I tried to translate that into how do I now do my research based on that, trying to understand what she's actually saying. And I think there is a big distinction, at least I see that in sustainability science. It's easy to talk about these relational philosophies, or not easy, but there's a way of talking about that. But then to actually translate that into our research and then how we approach knowledge, this really kind of flips around our way of approaching the world. And I think that makes it so difficult. And I still notice myself, like when I talk to people and when we write, for example, academic papers, we're constantly pointing out at each other, well, but here you're falling into the trap of approaching it mechanistically. And it's really hard to get out of that lens, I feel.
Yeah, me too. And some of it is just being aware that you're doing it, not necessarily not doing it.
Yeah.
Or even saying I'm coming at it from this angle, because then you understand that it's not everything,
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
seems like what you do in your work too, a bit, with the way that you talk about these very different, I mean, you bring up spirituality, you bring up the physical, the mental, the emotional. I feel like you're trying to show that kaleidoscope or that
Yeah.
complexity.
I mean, I sometimes think, like you as mentioned in the beginning, like the diversity of the background. And I think like one thing where this comes in handy almost is that, my studies, my first studies, it was very practical. So I learned more about like how do I build an engine than, what is academic work. So it was very practice oriented. So I didn't have so much the idea of these different disciplines. And I had this huge struggle when I started out at my PhD, that the topic that I wanted to do, I couldn't find a PhD supervisor. And I started with various professors, and they were like, well, I can help you with this, but this is actually, no, this is not working. And then they eventually start working together, or they said, I don't want to work with you anymore. And so it
And it
took
was the same topic,
Yes,
transformation, inner and
yes, it
outer.
was
Okay.
about inner transformation and sustainability. And then in my PhD proposals, I was always, take it quite big and have quite a big approach, which was alienating and not necessarily typical in academia, especially in Germany, where it's like academia, I feel, is especially siloed, and it's sometimes people are very hesitant about like unusual topics. So and now in sustainability science, the whole topic around inner transformation has become more established. But back when I started, it wasn't yet. So it took quite some time. And I think the benefit that I sort of had was that I don't have this strict academic discipline that I wanted to follow, and that kind of got me into just exploring wherever my interest took me, without having that glasses on beforehand. And it actually only later occurred to me, like, okay, this is how you divide disciplines, and this is what it really means. And yeah.
Yeah, it's always going back and forth. Some people want to, when we talk about interdisciplinarity, trying to make it where the boundaries aren't so apparent. But
Yeah.
then it sounds like you kind of came at it from the other way of, oh, okay, I can kind of see the differences, because, yeah, I guess a lot of us are trying to solve the same problems and even using sometimes the same text, but coming at it from different traditions, we can even
Yeah.
talk about the same things, but mean different things sometimes without
Yeah,
knowing it.
absolutely.
Do you think when you were trying to talk about inner transformation, was that difficult for professors? Because, this is love and philosophy, and
Yeah.
I'm talking to scientists, neuroscientists, people, and this word is very hard sometimes. I mean, for me too, thinking about it. But,
Yeah.
and also that line, which you talk about in your writing a bit too, of the simplification versus the
Hmm.
recognition of the complexity, or this becoming about something like self-help, which
Yeah.
and the way that maybe professors might look down on that. I don't know. Did you feel any of that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, very strongly. It's opened up a little bit, I feel, but especially when I started out, I was lucky to find a research group which also just started out exploring these topics with a quite established research institute here in Germany, and they were also just two people who had the liberty to kind of explore this topic. So one of our first goals was to sort of establish that as an actual topic to be discussed, and to start building a community around people who are already in their private lives, are concerned with that on a very high level. but don't really bring it into their professional fields, like especially sustainability scientists who often, sustainability, I think, is a good topic because a lot of people come to it actually through love and through caring about the world on such a deep level. And so in the beginning, it was really just trying to get the people together who were, somehow in their closet talking about it. And now I see how it's coming up in conferences. There's now a conference in the UK, which is accompanied by a pre-event where one of the main professors is doing like a shamanic journey for people beforehand to connect that to sustainability. So I really see a big shift there. But yeah, in the beginning it was quite difficult. And I still find that sometimes.
Yeah, well, that's
Depending
good
on who I
to
do.
hear that it's changing. Hopefully it continues. And I mean, it's always a balance, right? Do you ever
Yeah.
find you can go too far into,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I have this, or there's this one guy, he's writing on Substack. I think his name is Tom Morgan, and he has a scale at the beginning. He talks about the woo factor. And
Yeah, right.
I love that to bring it kind of as a warning and to show like, okay, we are self-aware that these things might be a bit ambiguous for some people, but there is so much to them. And yeah, but still when I talk to people sort of outside my bubble, I see how that can be alienating. Or sometimes I have that with students. So most of my students are also coming from a background in engineering, who are a lot of them are coming from India doing an MBA in Germany to work, for Tesla, the big car companies. And so I try to bring these perspectives in, and it's taking some finesse maybe if I were to bring these topics to them sometimes. Sometimes for some it's just like click, but for some it's difficult, I think.
What's the kind of class that you would teach where you would talk about that? Would it be,
Mm. Well, it's a classic MBA program, you could say, with a focus on different technologies. One of them is environmental and energy management, and they do have a basic class in sustainability or corporate sustainability, corporate social responsibility, and global management. So I bring these aspects into those sustainability management classes where I try to, explain the global context first through explaining the meta crises, and then
oh,
bringing that
it's
down
great that
to
you're doing that. I think that reminded me, somebody were they laughing at you because you used the term planetary health? Or,
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
does
yeah.
that happen often?
Not so much. So that was quite unusual, yes.
Okay.
And that was actually rather with peers, who were to whom this was so alienating, as they are coming not out of this bubble, but from a very different discipline. So yeah, they found
Hmm.
that funny. The students are fortunately a bit more
Yeah.
generous.
Do you think that it was funny because thinking of the planet as living was funny? Or because sometimes we laugh just because we're uncomfortable or we're caught off guard or whatever.
Yeah.
But
Um,
planetary health now sounds, it's funny how you get conditioned and you just, that sounds like a normal
yeah.
phrase. But then I do remember a time when it maybe would not have. So,
Yeah. I wonder if it's and I'd be curious to hear what you think as well, but I do wonder if it's, because it is humanizing the planet in a sense, or giving it a subjective agency. And I wonder if that is something that's still, like you said, like to us probably it's like the most normal thing. But I think to many people it is still very a weird concept.
yeah, and even for me, I can see how there could be dangers in that, even in the
Yeah.
way that I do it. Yeah, I think of these things as all connected and sort of fluid, and I wonder if you two do too. And by that I mean the planet, that in terms of trees and the
Hmm.
ecological world that we're all part of, and then the social groups of different beings, humans, my own body. It's become hard for me to think of those as really distinctly separated. I think they're
Hmm.
different and they have, different regularities that hold together differently, and we have
Hmm.
to understand that. But I also think, of course, in that relational way we brought up before, it's all interacting, it's all co-creating. And that, I wonder if that is the idea that sometimes we miss when we talk about the planet as a living being, because people do
Hmm.
shut off because they're seeing it as, oh, we're calling the planet a human, which
Yeah.
isn't quite the same thing. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And I find it interesting because now that you said that there might be, a danger in that, I think another danger, let's say, or another pitfall might be that, if we talk about the planning as like one, and if it is one, then we can't really relate to it anymore, because if we are, because we are distinct in some sense as well. And if we lose that distinction, and sometimes that's what I miss in the relational discourse, it's like relationship as and we are all one, but we are all also distinct, because otherwise we couldn't even relate. And so maybe if we see the planet, just as this one being, and don't acknowledge that we are also somehow a separate entity as part of that, then we don't question maybe so much how do we want to shape that relationship. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that is also what I feel like we have to learn a new way of talking about these things. And it comes from exploring it and the messiness of it being okay that we are separate individuals and different, and that we're all co-creating whatever you want to say together, the life, the planet, our neighborhoods, whatever. It goes back to that same thing I think you felt with your PhD, and that I still feel in some of your writing, of this having to choose between sides and it being so hard maybe and even tiring to try to hold both of them at once, and to even get people to open up their senses to what's the shared area of those
Yeah.
things. Do you feel like you're trying to do something like that in your work?
Yeah.
Or yeah.
And I think it's something that I also, it's very much a process I go through myself to, like, we often say like, we need to be able to hold paradoxes and ambiguity. And I still struggle with that
It's
in
hard.
so many ways.
Yeah.
Yes, to actually be in that space. And especially I think like sometimes, I tend to, if a group of people, and I don't have a specific example right now, maybe it comes to me a second, but if a group of people is going into, or if I read a lot and going into one direction, I often ask myself, okay, what could be the different perspective, and how is that not complete? And I try to bring the different perspective in. But by bringing in that different perspective, I often notice how I'm like, okay, like this was the truth, but no, it's this and that. And I think it's the same with, for example, the mechanistic and the relational type kind of thinking about the world. Like it is relational, but it also has a mechanistic point, and it has a separated, or separation in things. So trying to hold both of them, I think, yeah, for me, it's always tricky. And I'm still like, sometimes also readers point out, well, it's that, but isn't it also that? And I'm like, yeah, good point. I forgot about that in my thinking and writing. And to live with that, I think, can also be quite tricky, especially with paradoxes. Like one of the things that I've always been very prevalent in my life, and I think one of the guiding questions for me are this idea between the knowledge and action gap. It's referred to in sustainability science, or value action gap. Like, why do we value or know this but don't act accordingly? And eventually, it's that kind of, and I'm still sitting with it, but it's sort of occurring to me, like if there is this gap which can't be closed at all, and there seems to be like almost like two opposing sides, like maybe that's a completely wrong question, and it's actually like something in between, like a third space that's bringing me a lot closer to an answer, instead of trying to solve this puzzle which actually has no solution. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well said. And I think that's what we're all trying to do in our many different ways right now. We have to
Mm,
develop a new language almost to be able
yeah,
to do this. And it is hard because we just assume those kinds of things. Like you said, like there's a gap, and it's so built into our language and our way of thinking that we don't realize we did create that way of thinking about it. And it could be
yeah,
that knowledge, and it could be continuous. It might be, this is the mental physical kind of dichotomy too, or the inner outer.
yeah,
Maybe those are different assessments of a process that is the same. And how
yeah,
do we think of that? Because that means you can't make what is physical into what is mental, and you don't even need to, because you're assessing it from a different position. It's like,
yeah.
you know, but
I love
to
that.
really
Yeah,
hold that and understand that, I think it really requires all of us trying to help each other do it, because
yeah.
it's a very different future if we learn to think like that.
And I also, what you just mentioned about the language, that's something that I also came across, and constantly come across, of like, making verbs out of, or making nouns into verbs, and really sort of developing that. In my PhD, I actually started out when I wrote the final piece and created all sorts of words. And then I got scared and I actually threw it all out and a more conventional framing, and just said like, okay, we need to reinvent new words. And I think there's something to it, because it is alienating sometimes. So I find that a thin line between like developing new words, because we need a new language to actually describe what we are meaning, and at the same time, if people are coming to that who are not in that space or thinking in that space yet, it's very like, oh, what's that supposed to mean? Yeah, so we could almost be talking like different languages.
Yeah, and I think we are. It's one reason I want to have these conversations, because for example, the way you use relational, or I just had a nice conversation with Bayo Akamalafe, and he's also referencing similar people, and the way this use of relational and is different from, for example, how I learned participatory sense making and this 4E cognition, and which is also all built on relation up and down. And sometimes when we're just in conversation and we're using that word, we're coming at it from different ways. And it's not that those are bad, it's just that it opens up other paths if we understand what paths we've been on before.
Yeah, absolutely.
But holding all that complexity, again, it can be really overwhelming, can't it? I mean, I know you also have felt a sense of overwhelm, because I think that's part of it too, is I wonder what your experience is of it, of you have to take it slowly and be gentle with yourself, because you do start to realize how many layers and fractals and possibilities there are. And it can be overwhelming to also hold firm in your place, which is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to me, there's also what makes this topic so beautiful and interesting, that it's like uncovering layer upon layer. It feels like it's never going to end.
No.
Yeah.
But you did kind of come back to philosophy, and this continuity, I feel it in the way that you talk about philosophy, because sometimes you talk about philosophy as living, as a being, as I mean, I think of mind itself as a process, a verb, of our consciousness, of our living, that it's how we're making our way. And I feel like in the way you talk about philosophy too, it's a livingness. I think you even said sometimes you ask, is my philosophy tired or something?
Yeah.
Could you help us understand a little bit of how you've come to think of philosophy lately?
Yeah. I'll try to.
Knowing that we can't say it all.
Yeah, I mean, when I started out, the way I approached it, and when I saw or when I really dove into like philosophy, also as using the term philosophy, like one of the things was that I thought about it as like, okay, I want to find my philosophy. And I feel like this was one of the main drivers for a long time in my life without me even knowing. Like, I wanted to find, okay, what's the philosophy I can live by? What are the principles, values that I really want to see in my everyday life? And then I saw these two parts of like having a philosophy and living philosophically, or living that philosophy. So turning those values, belief systems, actually turning them into action. And I thought like, okay, these two parts make like philosophy as a way of life, or make philosophy tangible. And then eventually I noticed like, oh, but this having a philosophy, I've been searching for the philosophy now for the last 10 years, and I still haven't found it. And it's almost like at one point I'm like, should I give up hope that eventually I'm going to find it? But then I noticed, well, no, it's so much more about this process of finding it is actually living philosophically, and that's the beauty of it. And then I came to the conclusion, then it kind of noticed for the first time, well, philosophy is called love of wisdom. So but it's a love of it, and not having and possessing it. And the same for me became apparent with philosophy. Like, it's not something I have, but it's really something on the one hand, that I do, but also something that has sort of a life of its own, because as much as I have agency and as much as I can determine certain parts of that philosophy, but at the same time, it's always influenced by so many people, and it's always changing, adapting to my circumstances. So I will never be able to hold it. And as soon as I try to do that, I feel like it's already slipping away again. And if you go to the great philosophers who actually wrote down like a full philosophy, for them it made sense, but probably if you would talk to them now, it would also be very different. So what we get afterwards is like a momentarily result from what they have written down. And Sophie Strand talks about this a lot, about the difficulty of oral cultures versus written cultures, and written that it's then, it's like it's something that's fixed, but an oral culture would change the story over and over again, depending on who's narrating it and the circumstances. And I feel like with philosophy, it's actually sort of the same thing.
Mm-hmm. That also goes to that notion of maybe our tools, our languages, and so on being taken maybe too literally,
Yeah.
So when we write something, we think, oh, then that's the system, right? And it can never change. And I guess that's what you're talking about here too, is that we're starting to learn it's all a verb. And even the books that we have created are still going to be living and changing.
Yeah.
And that's part of the overwhelm too, I guess.
And what I noticed was, and at one point I asked myself, well, do we have, if language is so limiting in that way, like maybe, do we just need to talk in poetry, and is that more fruitful? And I thought like, oh, wow, I'm never going to be a poet. So and I saw like, well, there's different layers to that, because it's really like this. Also, what I do with, or I think any of us do with our writing, we do make this momentarily snapshot where we analyze a specific topic. And I think there is nothing wrong with it, but it really does help us to understand the world better, as long as we do not forget that it is part of a process and part of a larger content. So I don't think it's necessarily so much about, also in science, not only so much about how we do it, but rather how we think about it and how we contextualize it, or if we contextualize it at all. And yeah, especially in science, even though it's supposed to be, this open inquiry where we continue to learn, I feel like the way it's often talked about, or how people perceive it, it's like, well, it's science. This is like it's a written law that will never change, and is infinite in its value.
Yeah, that's also part of that holding paradox, or of science being the best we have towards, experimenting and finding truth, but also realizing everything we're studying and experimenting is changing too. So why wouldn't our science also have to,
Yeah.
like you can't just pinpoint it. Nothing's going to just stop. So we have to constantly keep refreshing all of that. But I wonder, like you talk about health, and I wonder what's the process of care, or where does health come into all this in terms of maybe even your own, I wonder about your own experience with the world around you and the way that you see the health of everything around you as related to your own health, and how all this is also, of course, connected to what we're talking about in terms of the thinking being part of that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the health aspect came to me because like if I ask myself what it is that I'm doing it for, it's like I'm not doing it, even though I'm also doing it because I love doing doing this work, but I always put it, or for me it has this greater context that I want to do it for personal as well as planetary health. And so for me, I often talk about eco-philosophy because, and this relates closely to health to me, because I think any philosophy, like one thing that I want to, at least what I have for myself as like the goal, is to always see it in this ecological context, which has planetary boundaries, which has a real physical reality to it, of right now a lot of species suffering, lots of devastation all around the world. So to never forget that this is the context that I'm moving in at this point in time, and to put that in the forefront. And then with health, I noticed how I have an autoimmune disease myself, and I noticed how a lot of the ways that how I relate to that disease, how I approach it, what I try to do against it, And the paths of healing, if there is even such a thing, and there's a lot to say about that, but that those are very similar, and that I see the same patterns like playing out in my own life with autoimmunity that I see also played out on a greater scale. Um, and this could be very simple things such as for example, I can't eat certain foods, but it doesn't kill me right away. It's just I notice that it's not very good for me. But then I have sometimes really hard time, and I mean, all of us know this. We grab food that we know is not necessarily the healthiest choice. And I see how, that pattern, it's just one simple example, but that is played out on such a grand scale across the whole planet with our consumption patterns, where we do know, this is not the best choice that I can make, but still I do that. So this knowledge action gap that I talked about also became, or that was one of the starting points, basically, that got me into this, like, how I approach that is also how I see that same pattern play out on many different scales.
Yeah, there's all these meta patterns you talk about,
Yeah,
and the way we treat ourselves and the way we treat everything around us, and
yeah,
vice versa too, right? The way we're treated and the way we parameterize how treatment or healing is possible.
yeah.
And I wonder what awareness, like that word awareness, or I'm not sure which word, but in the knowledge and action,
Hmm.
sometimes there's a space of recognition or
Yeah.
of just becoming aware of the pattern, which is then going to change it in a way. How have you experienced that
Hmm.
part of it, or have you? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the great possibilities. I recently read a nice book called Choice Points, where it's this moment where we do have the possibility to make a choice. And I think that's one of the great capacities of being a human. At the same time, because our agency is somehow distributed, I think there is, and this is again a paradox I like to play with and kind of sit in, of like, yeah, we have all this agency where we can make that choice. And on the other hand, is that choice really ever our own, or is it, entangled with so many other beings and contexts and space and time that it's emerging out of the ether
Hmm.
in a way where it's actually not our own at all.
And it's always both of those. In the
Yeah.
moment, we always have a little bit of agency, and we also have the agency to communicate about it with others, and that starts to perhaps change those other patterns. And yet, if we're in a war zone or something, we're in a completely different set of what's possible for us. So again, it's
Absolutely.
that context. Yeah. But I guess I was trying to get at the thinking part of it,
Uh-huh.
that I wonder if there's been some, because you talk about practice a lot,
Mm.
and your institute is for practical eco philosophy, right? Which we should maybe
Yes.
talk about that in a minute. So I guess like with these practices, because I feel like you've been trying to help people and help find ways for yourself and those
Yeah.
around you to deal with this health, that we want to move towards a space of health
Yeah.
in our own lives or in the world, wherever we are.
Yeah.
And that is a kind of transformation. And you've been looking at practical ways to do that. So
Hmm.
what does that practice or practicality? I don't know which word
Yeah.
you would choose, but what does that bring up for you?
Um, yeah, for me it's and it's again yeah, kind of a not I don't want to say paradoxical question, but I think it's a bit tricky, and I think it can cause yeah, different opinions on that. But for me, what came out was that at one point when I started about like how do I turn these philosophies into practice, one of the ideas that I always had like is like, I need to do something, somehow there's a strong sense of having to do something big. And I think that's connected to how we live our lives. So it has to be like even something that I can snapshot or put on, it has to be that I can photograph or, scale to some degree. Um, and thinking in terms of action and practice in that terms of like something that I can share. It needs, or that only then it becomes real. And I think of practice a lot more as the integration into my everyday life and all these tiny micro decisions that I make or choices that I make and how I show up that are not necessarily possible to scale or to put on Instagram or whatever. And it can be and talking about awareness, it could be the way I relate to my dog, to my neighborhood, to the people outside, to how I eat, how I carry myself, how I show up to people, am I present, am I not present? So all these micro things that seem, and I like 5 years ago, I would have never thought that I'd be the person who says like, okay, this is a necessary practice, because I was all about like, it needs to be like something big, and
Oh, really? Okay.
we need to make like grand changes. And then eventually I know there's so much beauty in these little things. And I've always practiced, in my own lifestyle, you could say, and lifestyle, that's also already an alienating word to some people, but I really found it in like things such as wearing just the same dress every day or so. What does it do to me? What does it tell us about our relationships to fashion, to beauty, to how we think we need to be in the world? And one thing I think about these micro habits is if I do think about us as really being part of a complex system, and more about the relationships, and as me as just like a fractal, and the relationships that I play out just as a fractal of the whole, then that it needs a leap of faith maybe in a sense, but it's also on a logical understanding, like, are the patterns that I play out, and all these tiny relationships are also the patterns that are played out on a grander scale. And there is no distinction. Like when is the scale big and when is it small? Like this is just so, yeah.
That's a beautiful realization. I think that's a really, really powerful when you can understand that these, yeah, you can change the pattern of your fractal and it changes the patterns of all the fractals, even if it seems very slight. These
Yeah.
little things somebody says to you at the grocery store, or some little change you make, just maybe sitting down and taking a breath. And, these small things can really change the whole of your day. And if you just understand that, and then you think, in these wider nested
Yeah.
levels, how that happens, it becomes a real source of, what is it, of power, I guess, of real
Yeah.
power.
Yeah. That's at least how I perceive it. And it's also, um, I like this paradox of like, again, a paradox of like thinking like everything matters, like every tiny action I make matters. And then on the other hand, none of it, like on a very grand scale, none of it really matters. But again, it's like sitting in that exact sweet spot. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, how to hold that. And by holding is a very important thing, because if you hold it too tight, you're going to, asphyxiate it or kill it. And if you
Yeah.
don't hold it tight enough, then, or if you don't hold it at all, then you're not touching it, you're not in contact, and so it's not there. So that is a very, very open area of how we can all do this together. But have you found that you can understand that the small things matter so much, and also that you can relax into being a bigger part of life, that we are just a drop in the ocean?
Mhm.
Have you found that's gotten easier to,
Yeah.
yeah?
I find it easy. I still find I still struggle with it sometimes, and
Yeah. Well, it's
some,
kind of a struggle with itself, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
it's, yeah.
And there is things, that I see that, I mean, so many things are so heartbreaking, and then it's like, okay, there's nothing I can do immediately. Like that's really still for me also a challenge. Um, and I think this is a bit where where sometimes we talk about like, yeah, we need to think global and act local. That's like a thing that, and I think this is also where we can try to keep the whole in mind, while at the same time, seeing, okay, what is it that we can actually do in our patterns? And what I found when I started in the field of sustainability, what I found really crazy was how many people and I still to this day, when I see how many sustainability scientists just fly around the world and they are talking about veganism, but then they go and, and eat their hot dog. And there is such a contradiction. I mean, we are all sitting with that, and we are all contradictory to some degree. And I think that it can't be otherwise, because the systems we have created are, of course, kind of enforcing, or of at least incentivizing the sort of behavior that is not necessarily conducive to great life conditions. But to never see how we are part of that system, I think and it's not even necessarily judgmental, but it's also robbing us of so much potential and so much power and empowerment in a way when we think of, oh, yeah, we need to change everything around us, but never think about how we are part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it can be very hard to think, well, okay, everyone else is doing it. It's not going to matter if I decide to stay home and not fly to the conference.
Yeah.
But then it does. And yeah, and then there's also, we need to find ways to be together in person again. So yeah, there's a lot there. But I think I want to ask you about how it feels for you. Two things kind of stuck with me when you said that you used to want the big act, or
Hmm.
some kind of, I don't know, is it about having attention, or because I think it relates to this optics too of all of us kind of trying to get each other's attention even if we don't want to participate in that system, or feeling like we need attention or likes or follows or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder about you, like, also the second thing was when you said sometimes it's just too much.
Hmm.
I have that too sometimes, where when you really look at the world and you really love it, because I think it's coming out of a place of care, it's almost too much. It's almost, how can you possibly really see everything the way it is? Even the love sometimes is hard, to feel so
Yeah.
much, to want to do so much, and then to feel that pressure. So I guess, those two things don't seem to go together much, but you said you've changed and you're not necessarily looking for the big optics anymore.
Mm.
Does it connect to how you feel in that place of care in any way? Has it changed, how that for you, or?
Mm. Um, yeah, I mean I think the place that I still come from is that place of care for the whole, and I think that's beautiful how you put that. Um, but I think there is a difference between what do I actually care about, and then what's actually my response to that. There's this famous scale of like how far our circle of concern is for people, if it's just for our family, just for ourselves, if it goes beyond that towards the whole cosmos. And um, if I don't really have any way to respond to that, then there is a very important part of care lacking. Like Eric Fromm, for example, he talks about love as like this active act of where it's not a feeling, but it's something that we do. Um, so I think this love for the planet will have to translate into something that makes me respond to it in an actual way that I can, if that is
Mm-hmm.
answering or relating
Yeah, that's
somehow
kind of
to.
what I'm trying to get at, is where is it personal for you?
Mm,
Where do you see those lines connecting between these big, huge,
mm,
try to save the world, or we have to be sustainable and we have to change all these actions, and knowledge acquisition, and then just your care for yourself and for your immediate, my dog is here for my dog, and
yeah.
the plants that are outside, which I don't maybe take care enough of. Um, yeah, I just, like, do you see a relationship there in, for example, the way you've started the Substack,
Hmm.
um, that's a very personal space,
Mm,
but you're
mm,
also talking about very big issues. And I can feel you sometimes trying to hold the tension there of, if you write the title is like, this is going to solve all your
yeah.
problems, then you're going to get tons of people looking at it.
Yeah.
Um, and
Okay.
but then how do you deliver that from a place that's
Yeah,
care of
absolutely.
care? Because the whole thing really is very caring. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I wonder about this, if
Ah,
if
that's
I'm right to feel that sort of tension in the.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I sit with all the time, and I think many of us do,
Yeah.
because it's like we don't want to participate in the system, and that this is the tension I think that the same pattern that plays out in so many systems. We don't want to participate, but still we're somehow part of it. So
Mm-hmm.
can we not
Mm-hmm.
not participate? And I don't have a good answer or conclusion for that, except of like, and this is where it maybe gets a bit. Uh, I don't want to say no. I think it's valid, but it's really something that I try to feel into. So, and to make it public, or to speak out. At least I try to point out, like, okay, I do that because I know it's getting your attention. So I'm pointing out the things that I do in order to increase our awareness for that, and to not try to trick anyone into it, but rather to to still engage with the people. Though I talked to one person recently, and she said also, like, yeah, if we keep talking only in a specific way, we just continue talking to the same people, basically. So how do we draw new people in, who we think might benefit from it? And I think this is where it comes to language again. Also, it's like sometimes it needs this sort of different language. And I think that's the challenge of the written word, of like, and sometimes we feel like, are we betraying ourselves if we now in this context we speak like this, and then in a different context we speak a bit differently? But I don't think it is that way, but it's rather about the intention we bring into it, and trying to resolve these difficult issues. And I think especially, like, I mean, one of the things, as we are in this time in between, these different worlds, I think it always needs to hold both. Like, on the one hand, try to show, like, okay, this is the real horizon and this is where we ideally want to get to, but we are here somewhere in the middle, and this is still, the part where a lot of people maybe feel rather cold to, and how we speak to them. So sometimes we can go here or we can go here, and depending on that, it needs sort of a different translation, maybe.
I wonder if do you think of it as an experiment a little bit, in the same way you were talking about with wearing the same dress, which maybe we should talk about that a minute. You wear the same dress every day as a kind of an experiment to see how you feel, see how others respond.
Yeah.
I'm sure you wash it and so forth. I'm sure everyone wants to know that. It's the first thing.
That's the first thing everyone asks. Yeah. I have a tricycle, I can wash it. I'm actually learning to sew it myself at the moment.
Okay. Oh, wow, great. You can sew your own dresses.
Yes.
But is it also in the writings that you're offering to people? Are you also trying to experiment with your own, displacement?
Absolutely. And I see this is for me an important framing that's become so prevalent, that I see a lot of my life choices rather as experiments. I'm currently sitting with this concept of life as a living lab, and a living lab or real world laboratory is something that's a concept, especially in sustainability science, where you have, over a long period of time, ideally like 60, 70 years, you experiment with in certain settings, in a real life settings, and then you do little experiments, and it has a broader context, this laboratory, real world laboratory. And I see life in general, whether it's this real world laboratory in which I can experiment. And I think this whole notion of experimentation and trying to get feedback to see how it is and then adapting, I think that's, for me, become very important. And I see how that's making my life a lot more fun and easier on the one hand, but also such an important skill, because in complexity or complex systems, that's, we need that feedback and this experimentation in order to move forward.
And to find different state spaces. And and I feel that in your work, and in a way it connects to everything we've been talking about, because there is a kind of a sweet spot of, you raise the word intention, but also experimentation, where and it is the place of holding paradox that I try to, that is hard to put words to, but where you are coming at it from a place of care, but you're also understanding that you have all of these, like, maybe you just want attention. Of course you want readers, and and that you're okay with all of that, and you're able to show that in the work, and there's something about that I definitely feel in your pieces and in your practice and in your projects. But that space isn't easy to negotiate. Do you worry about criticism? Do you worry about trying to please everyone?
Not so much, to be honest, because for me it's so obvious myself that I'm doing it. So even if someone points out to me like, yeah, you're using clickbait, or and I didn't fly for a long time, I think for the past 5 years or so, but if I were to step on a plane again, and I will likely soon, because I want to see friends in the US, if they pointed out, I can only admit it. Like it's not, I see, and I'm definitely not seeing all of it. We all have our blind spots, but a lot of the things where I'm thinking like, okay, this is not how I would ideally love to have it. Yeah, I'm happy actually when people point that out rather than
Oh, that's good.
feeling
That feels healthy.
defensive about it. Yeah.
I think we have to go pretty soon, but I wanted to ask about this word wild.
Yeah.
What's the wild? Because it's rewilding, it's wild health,
Yeah.
and I love that word wild.
Yeah,
And I
same here.
wonder, yeah, I
Yeah.
want to hear about it from you.
It has different angles. So one of them is that I love the word wild too. I think in my own life, like I've always have had a sort of a wild aspect to my own life.
Hmm.
So it feels personal in a sense. It's also I there is no such thing as wildlife. And there's a whole discussion about that. But nonetheless, it has this first intent or inclination that we hear into it. And that's what I love. And the third point is that um there is this book where he talks about wild problems, and the way he describes wild problems are basically complex problems. And I think wild is a good um, explanation just of the world we live in right now and the state of the world. It seems wild, and it's probably always been like that. But yeah, so those are the three angles.
Yeah, that's good. And also feeling, there's a book I have it somewhere. It's like Women Who Run with the Wild. It's a
Yes.
Jungian. Yeah, you know
Yeah.
this book? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also that kind of sense of wildness, which I like a lot.
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to also ask you about your artwork before we go,
Hmm.
because I love the artwork that you do, and you are
Thank
doing it,
you.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
are you also, have you been doing art your whole life too on the side from mechanical engineering and sustainability science and
Not really, but it's I do love I always wished that I could paint or draw, and I'm not talented in that way at all, but I never really tried it either. Um, but I love to look at beautiful things, and I couldn't really find pictures that would go well with the articles. So at one point I just started to use Pixelmator a bit and really just from a very amateur perspective started playing with it, and it's become part of the process of putting my care and my expression of the article like into the art world, which is not cognitive, but rather I just put music on and get into the flow of trying to express on a different scale of what I want to say. So it's become an important part of the process, actually. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that because it feels like it, and it feels like it's a part of the writing.
Yeah. Wow,
Yeah.
I'm happy, very happy to hear that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And I think it also does some of that holding we've been talking about too, because sometimes you can say things with those photos that you can't necessarily put, into words. So,
Yeah. And I've just recently started to, wanted because I always felt a bit of a tension because I was using, pictures from other people and bringing that into a new collage. So lately I've started to take the whole picture of some of the main elements and put them within the article to show where it's actually coming from, and it feels a lot more aligned. And also got me this kind of showed me out. This is one of the tension or one of the things that I love to bring with these collages, these new contextualizations, which create worlds in a way.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does do that, even on a subconscious level sometimes.
Mm, yeah.
Well, is there anything that you wanted to bring up before we go? We didn't talk about the Institute for Practical Eco-Philosophy. I don't know if you want to introduce that or anything that you.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm always happy if people are interested on working, also just being related to the institute, seeing where possible or collaboration is possible. I mean, we're just starting out. We are just two people right now, so very small. And one of the ambitions that I have with it is that to really bring this idea of living philosophically to life. And one thing that I have been sitting with a lot and is this idea of, ah, yeah, why do we need philosophy and living philosophically? Like, is it for personal and planetary health? Is it for a vital life, for a peaceful life, or what is it for? And at one point, I noticed like, it is about living philosophically in itself. Like it's that is the thing already. So it's yes, it is for a peaceful life. Yes, it is for an adventurous life or whatever, however you define a good life. And I would love to see that at one point in my life to really be a value in itself, and something worth pursuing. And yeah, I hope to contribute to that with the institute.
What's a philosophical workout?
Um,
Is that trying to work out all the stuff we've been talking about? And
so one of the things that or one of the ways that I think about it is, I mean, it's just starting out. We started these philosophy gyms last year.
I love that idea, philosophy gym. I mean, that's
Yeah.
a wonderful kind of melding of inner and outer and mental and physical and all that.
Yes, yes. And when it started out, we're like, okay, it's about like, how do we bring our philosophy into our everyday life? Like, this is what it's going to be about, without really knowing what that even means. And the way it turned out, though, the group that we have been forming there is that it really became this collective sense-making sessions where certain topics that all of us care about deeply, we would, try to make sense of it in all different ways. And I think this is what it's been developing into. I mean, there's different aspects to it. And yeah, I'm still in the process of developing that. Where I just started a project which is funded by the European Union across 5 different countries, where we develop philosophy gyms for regenerative futures in small and medium enterprises.
Oh, wow.
It's a long word.
That sounds wonderful, but what is that exactly?
Yeah, and this is what we just started in January, really, where we are now trying to develop philosophy gyms and the format for companies. And for me, I think the aspect that I would like to have in there is this idea, and now coming back to the paradoxes and simplifying, but of finding a philosophy, like where are we actually coming from, understanding what are other people's philosophies, how can we then collaborate with these other philosophies or these other ideas. And then also bringing that aspect in of a bit what you talked about yesterday, is different ways of knowing, because all of them are forming our philosophies. And then the third aspect is, which I think is relevant for companies, which I notice are often sitting with the tension of like, these are the ethical decisions I would love to make, but these are the realities in the system that I'm facing. And there is no blueprint and no final idea of how to go about that. So how can we find ways to engage with these or help companies engage with these issues? So these are three of the core ideas at the moment, and we'll see what it develops into.
And do you think bring in this experimental approach to that? Yeah. Because it does seem simple but profound to just actually have a space where people work out ideas together and notice their ideas, and to have a space where you do that as a company or as individuals or as a group of friends, living the question.
Yeah. And one of the things that we're also doing a test run with Grokist, it's called. It's a platform very worth checking out. And there we are also running a philosophy gym over seven weeks to see, sort of experiment a little further with that and see what philosophy gyms ideally incorporate. And also coming back to what we talked about earlier about the measurement, how could we measure the success of a philosophy gym and measure the immeasurable and the quality that maybe goes into it and that I've experienced so far in these spaces, and sort of what Noah Bateson calls warm data. How can we maybe translate that further? So this is another experiment this is taking.
Yeah. I like that. And also thinking of measurement differently in a dynamical way that we were saying, so that, even when you're just assessing your own philosophy, it's a kind of a measurement, and measurements are very helpful. And we need these measurements and these maps and these metrics, but also not taking them as so seriously as we were saying before, that as if they're never going to change. It's gauging where we are on this part of the path, and the next part of the path is going to present maybe something slightly different. It's a different kind of approach, I guess.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to see where it's going.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love all the ideas. There's so many. It's so rich. So I send you a lot of support for that. Okay. All right.
Dog here, so.
Oh, I can't see. What kind of dog do you have? Ah! Want to come?
Oh. Oh. Similar. The haircut a little bit.
Well, thanks for all you're doing. I really enjoy your Substack. I'm so happy to share it with everyone. And the philosophy gym idea is great too. And yeah, good luck with everything.
Thank you to you too. Looking forward to continue learning from you. And thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.